Hello and welcome to the next session. Welcome to the session called Blazor and Bot Framework, a Microsoft Teams Platform Dream Team. My name is Tommy Goelles, and apologies for not being two persons in this session live today. We planned that Stefan and I, we are colleagues and basically working in the same team. We'll deliver the sessions together, but unfortunately, I got sick last week and Stefan got sick today. Luckily, he recorded his session already because we had struggles with the planning. So, thank you for your attention, and you need to bear with the next 45 minutes for me alone, and we will focus on the Blazor part. Stefan talked in the last hour about the bot part, did a short demo with the bot composer and showed some connection cards or adaptive cards that you can use to connect to different people. And we will now have a look to the Blazor part of Teams development. Before we do that, for those people that might missed Stefan's sessions before, a few slides, and then I promise I only have 3 or 4 slides. We will jump right into the different versions of Visual Studio to really get our hands dirty with code. Of course, we are working and focusing on code and on applications, services, workers, whatever you create on top of Microsoft 365. In this talk, we're focusing on development for Teams, but as you will see, you could also take this technology based on Blazor, as it is just a Teams application, and possibly render that as well in SharePoint. And there are some discussions that there might be future endpoints as well for Teams applications, but let's see what the build conference might bring us there in that regards. But for today, of course, as we work with Microsoft 365, Fluent UI, the Graph Toolkit, adaptive cards, everything that basically takes consideration of what the Microsoft Graph offers is an important part of those applications, but it's not the only resource or not the only direction you can go. Of course, you should look at those tools if your data lives in Microsoft 365 or you plan and architect to store data in Microsoft 365, then of course it makes sense to use all those great tools. Sometimes you are creating applications based on your business needs or on existing applications that might already store data. So you have made existing applications that you want to make Teams aware or SharePoint aware. In that regards, you are going back to basically normal web development stacks, and then you might end up in a scenario where you have some data living in Microsoft 365 and make use of all the power the graph gives us, and then go back to, in my case, regular.NET and use, I don't know, Entity Framework Core or Azure Functions to store your data in Cosmos DB, in SQL for Azure, or in SQLite, whatever is your way, basically. So this, of course, is always important if your data is stored within your Microsoft 365 tenant. Same slide as Stefan had in his session about Teams as a platform and the opportunities and the possibilities you can create. You saw in the last hour a lot about bots. We will focus today on tabs, but I want to remind you that task modules are nothing else than tabs on the technical side. So you could reuse most of all, let's say 99% of what we will see today, you can reuse in task modules. You need just to do something different in terms of a notation that you need to follow to make task modules work inside of Teams. And the interesting part is that you see on this, of course, the slide is coming from Microsoft. You see a couple of options how to create applications and services within Microsoft Teams, the different types that you can use: bot framework, web technologies, the SharePoint framework, Power Platform, Microsoft Graph, GitHub, and Visual Studio. Okay, that's more like tools, not that necessary. You could use your own text editor or whatever version control you favor, of course. But for the next 40 minutes, we will focus on web technologies. And we will actually focus on something else that is not mentioned over here. So no JavaScript, no React, no Angular. We will focus on Blazor. And we will start to make a few things clear, because Blazor is one of the hyped topics in .NET, and not only in .NET, but it's also, as one part of Blazor is the WebAssembly part, and WebAssembly basically gets a big push since I think 3 or 4 years, where it was the first time introduced. But we need to be very, very careful in the decision or in the terminology with two things. First, which version of Blazor are we going to using today? Because there are two different versions. There is a version that is focusing on WebAssembly, and then there's a version that's called Blazor Server. That's more a traditional way with a front end and a classic server serving those files and a connection from the client with Signal R to the server back. With Blazor WebAssembly, you're basically pushing down everything to the client, meaning markup files as Razor components, and also your assemblies. It's called WebAssembly for a reason, because you are pushing down assemblies. So you're pushing down DLLs to the browser, and everything lives inside the browser. That's an important and an interesting technology, because that's basically where progressive web applications can be created on top of that way. So you can install something locally. You could even create applications that live offline, because you don't need to talk back to a possible server in the backend, because everything you have is in the client. And that's a very important differentiation between WebAssembly and Blazor Server. Just think of Microsoft 365 authentication, and where do you store your client secret, your client ID? If everything gets pushed down to your client instance, that's not regarded as a secure client. If you're using, for example, a client ID or client secret as a web.config file, that's somewhere in there. And if you're doing some security work, there's always this Alice and Bob figure, and Bob normally is the bad one. Some Bob will find out your secrets if you just push them down to the server. So that's from my understanding, and that's probably also one of the reasons why the Teams toolkit at the moment, or was created around Blazor Server first, but there are already movements in the working, and first pre-releases also are taking consideration to create Blazor applications based on WebAssembly. But those two different things are, Blazor is something else. It's more a top-level term. We will always need to distinguish between WebAssembly, Blazor client, and Blazor Server that's using a different technology. And the next important thing is we will, in a few seconds, I will talk you through the actual GitHub page of the Teams toolkit. Very important, we are having a look today at preview software. So the Teams toolkit in no form or shape is in GA, so general available, in a regular release already. We're still looking at preview pieces and preview releases. And it, from my understanding, and I'm not with Microsoft, so I can say that with some distance, it looks like they had a really hard time to naming things. Because there is the Teams framework, there's Teams toolkit, there are different parts, and we will have a look shortly at the web page where you can see all those parts in GitHub and discuss the details. But the Teams toolkit is also something that is available in two different versions. The Teams toolkit is available for TypeScript and everything you can create in Visual Studio Code. And then there is the Teams toolkit for Visual Studio we will discuss today. And that Visual Studio part has the Blazor support. And this Blazor support basically comes again in two different flavors. And apologies, but that's just the way it is. We are in a previous stage, and they are getting more and more features and more and more ready for releasing the final version. So I'm sometimes confused myself with all those different names, but I rather have this confusion in a preview phase than get no information and be surprised with a release somewhere soon. So it's more work, it's more focus needed to make it clear and understandable what are the different versions, but we can already play with the bits. And the Visual Studio part then again comes with two different versions, one for 2019 and one for 2022. They are, the first one was a Teams Toolkit, just an extension in Visual Studio. We will have a look at this first, and then we will play with the latest one that is released or was released, if I remember correctly, on February 15th. So that's not so long ago. And that's available with Visual Studio 2022, starting with the version 17.1. So you need to update Visual Studio 22 to get the latest bits. And I will show you where's the difference. But before we really go into Visual Studio, 1 second to make that clear. You can have a look, and I highly encourage you to go to github.com/office-dev/teamsfx. That's basically the page that summarizes or tries to document what I was talking about for the last 12 minutes with all the different namings and naming conventions. As you see, the IDE extensions for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code named Teams Toolkit, then they are embedded in what's called the Microsoft Teams Framework or Teams FX. And then you have the different parts in here that are needed for the toolchain to work in Visual Studio Code and in Visual Studio. If you're interested in the Visual Studio part, there is a folder, where are we? Packages.NET SDK. Basically, it's living in here, and you can actively have a look at what's going on and what's the latest development there. They are in some way also accepting PRs. Most of the time it's not so that they are directly gonna accept your PR, but you can propose one, and then one engineer of the team will have a look at the implementation and see it as an idea and maybe create his own version for it. And that's for me the perfect way moving forward, as we are talking about the core component Microsoft is delivering and not something that's done by the community. So giving input is still possible. They have a lot of open issues and a lot of open and transparent discussion, so you can have a look there as well. Okay, with that, let's start with how to install it for Visual Studio 2019, and then we will really go into the demo for the latest version. In Visual Studio 2019, I'm just opening up, and we will not discuss the project in detail because we will focus on the latest version. But if you are in the need of something that still runs with .NET 5 and you have Visual Studio 2019 available as an only option, you can go in there and go to Extension and Manage Extensions. And then if you search for Teams, you find those two things. We are interested in what's called the Teams Toolkit. This Microsoft Teams app extension is an older one. That was the very, very first approach on how to create applications with .NET for Teams. But we are discussing Microsoft Teams Toolkit. So you would need to install the preview version of this extension to get this structure that you see here and basically get what's called the F5 experience, meaning you open up Visual Studio, create a new template based on a Microsoft Teams application already, and then you press F5 and you're up and running. That's what we will see in a couple of minutes. But if you are on Visual Studio 2019, .NET 5 train still, then that's your way to go forward. If you are living already with Visual Studio 2022, you can go in there and open up the Visual Studio installer. You see here my different versions. And with the version 17.1.0, so one of the latest one, a couple of weeks old, you can go in there and click on Modify. And in the ASP.NET web development packages, individual components. Where are we? Don't see it here. Let me go in here. Must be part somewhere down there. It's always so hard to find those things. Unbelievable. I tried that a couple of minutes ago. There we are. Microsoft Teams development tools. So you need to install those things. And interestingly enough, I had that already installed. It's now unchecked and total space required is 0 bytes. So something is off with the installer, it seems. But this is basically the package you want to install, Microsoft Teams development tools, to be able to use it with Visual Studio 2022 and going forward. Important, this part is only available if you update to the latest release version. We will discuss it with one of the preview versions already, but that's not important for this talk. You can get that with the latest Visual Studio version already, but still the Teams Toolkit is in a preview version. And what do we get if we install that correctly? So let's fire up a new instance of Visual Studio 2022 and create a new project. You see here, I have a Microsoft Teams application project template. I select that. What should we call that? Austria Developer Community Day 2022 Teams Toolkit Demo. So we will remember that name or we will don't need to remember that. We will see that name again a few times later. I click on Create. And then you see here a wizard that is already coming from the component I already pre-installed. I can select a tab here. Just a short addition or information on this screen. There is the older part in the 2019 version. You will also able to create a bot with there was a nice image and a bot down there. They removed that for now because they were not happy with the preview version of the bot implementation. This will come in the coming months, so it's still on the roadmap. It's still out there to be delivered, but not part of the latest preview. So there's a tab only, select the tab, and then very important, select an account, meaning an account that is connected to one of your Azure instances. I take my development account from one of my Microsoft 365 development tenants, and I will highly encourage you to do the same because this account basically needs high privileges in two different areas. First, this account or the account that you select there needs to be able or needs to have the permissions to create Azure AD applications in the tenant. Plus, it also needs the permissions to create a Teams application in the Teams developer portal. So for development purposes or for testing that out, the easiest route would be to create your own development tenant and then add this account as the main account basically of your Microsoft 365 developer tenants is global admin in both regards, so you wouldn't have an hiccup. Because if I click on create here, what is going to happen is Visual Studio now scaffolds the project with the given or the selected template, but it's not only doing that, it's doing a couple of things more actually. Let me show you that down there. And I zoom in for the sake of visibility. You see that already with the creation, just by clicking on create of the project, it created an Azure AD application in my tenant and created a client ID, specified identifier endpoints, tab endpoint, OAuth authority. So a couple of settings already taken care of on my tenant. And that's why I was stressing the permissions before that, because if you don't have sufficient permissions for those actions, of course, you wouldn't, or Visual Studio wouldn't be able to create the project successfully. So that's already created by scaffolding the project. Of course, we could discuss now if this is the proper or a correct way for tooling to work. I really don't think that's the best way if it really just creates stuff without letting you know before. I would prefer that to be a task that I could click and do proactively and nothing that the toolkit does by itself. But on the other hand, there's a strong argument because what we are able to do now is that we opened up Visual Studio, created a new project. I didn't change anything, nothing at all. And I'm able to click Start Debugging, press F5. So let's do that. Just start the application. The only thing that I need to prepare right now probably is my credentials, but let's see. No, looks good. So I'm already in a browser session of Teams at the installation screen of my Austria Developer Community Day 2022 Teams Toolkit demo application that will or that surfaces the built-in app coming with the template. I'm clicking on Add. This takes a couple of seconds, no worries. Here we are, and we have our application here. So it already, by just clicking F5, I'm up and running, have my Teams application there. And that's, of course, something interesting if you really want to speed up the development process, because basically the toolkit now took care of everything. I was just opening up Visual Studio, provided a name, and then off we go. Of course, a few things. If you're looking at it from a professional developer perspective, you might want to have a different name of your solution or your project and the application name in Teams, and maybe also a different name for the Azure AD application. That's not possible right now if you use that train, but you could change that for now. But think of it more as like, okay, that's yeah, a rapid starter, an application starter for people that really try to get started and learn things. And we will see that later on, that there is another way also where you have an existing application that you just pull in some NuGet packages and make it Teams aware, where you basically don't go that way. But I find it very interesting that they created something that really, by just opening Visual Studio and F5ing into the application, you're up and running, and also a way for more experienced or more corporate enterprise developers to have a way forward. But what we see here now is already the application that gets now surfaced on my local host. So you see that Visual Studio is running and still surfacing this application. And we will now have a look at how this application is built, architectured, and how this cooperation or interop works with Microsoft Teams. For that, let's have a look at the structure over here, and you see nothing too fancy if you're familiar with web development or with Blazor. So there's a couple of folders in here with pages, controllers, a root folder. Of course, that is the place where the files are hosted. And then, of course, AppRaiser, programs, yes. So nothing too fancy. It's more like a classic Blazor application that get or got something, some additional files regarding the Teams part of the house, so to speak. But let's stop that for a second. So we have that a little bit bigger here. What you're gonna do now is that we walk you through the different parts of that application. And I want to start with the tab.razor. The tab.razor basically is the main entry page, the main thing that starts the application. Why is that important? Let me find that special file. Here we have our manifest.json. So in properties, there is the launch settings that has the settings what happens if you press F5. And then you have the manifest.json that is basically your team's manifest. And the tab is important because you see here, we have here the configuration part that the content URL and the website URL of our static tab actually is localhost /tab. And the configuration part is over here with localhost /config. That's the first part. If we going now from top to bottom or from outside to inside, what's going on the implementation side. So like an onion, we are going to try to go from layer to layer to layer to the core. We will see now here is a tab, and that's important because your tab razor page over here has this tab route defined. So that's how this solution basically knows, okay, if a client calls me with /tab, I need to surface that tab.razor. That tab.razor is highly sophisticated. It has a diff and has a welcome component. And that's this welcome component is already something coming from Blazor, because in Blazor you can use Razor components to structure your application. And this welcome component is part of this components folder here. So it's one of the good practices developing Blazor applications is that you should create components that, you can name the folder what you want, but it's like a standard notation, of course, to call it components. And then there are the different Razor files in there. If you see this, and this is of course just a sample solution in a proper client project or in a proper enterprise project, you might want to take those Razor components of this component folder and put it in an additional project that only is a Razor library, so that you can reuse your Razor components not only in this Teams application, but maybe in another application as well. That's very interesting, especially if you think of .NET MAUI and what is coming to us in the coming months. Speaking of .NET MAUI, you will be able to use Blazor applications, Blazor components to be precise, in .NET MAUI to surface and to be used in the different platforms that .NET MAUI addresses, meaning the desktop, iPhone, Android phone, iOS Watch, all those different platforms that are reachable basically with .NET MAUI. There is a way to use Blazor in .NET MAUI to reuse all those components. So that's an interesting angle and an interesting opportunity for people that are already invested in Blazor applications and might want to just go the way and say, okay, I want to also have a representation in Teams. But if you have more like a general application that might be only have endpoints in Teams, in a desktop application, in a mobile application, you can definitely, or you will be able to use .NET MAUI and Blazor technology to deliver those things. And then it's of course very important to take those components and basically outsource them to their own project. But let's dive into this welcome component. So we have here a notation based on the Razor notation. So we have normal HTML, and of course, that's the interesting part coming from Blazor. We have C# on the client side here. So we can use the C# language, the C# syntax notation to make this if statement here. And if is loading, so if this variable is true, we are showing the diff with the fluent and the fluent progressive ring here basically. If not, we are basically surfacing our application. How does this work? We have in this Razor file an HTML part, and down there's a code part. Before you get crazy and are now turned off by that overlapping of C# code in Razor files, of course, you could also create a code behind file. You just need to call it welcome.razor.cs, and then it's like the CSS isolation file that's used here. Also, you're also able to basically create a Razor page, create a backend file as we are used as ASP.NET developers in your own C# classes, and then just have the markup part in Razor there. For me, that's a question of taste to some degree. I totally agree that it makes no sense to really have business logic in Razor files in here, but for these demo purposes or for the simplest simplistic application, I don't mind if there are a couple of lines in here. If it's too intense, of course, create your own C# file. That would be the better way going forward. But you see here, we already are using Microsoft Teams components, libraries, extensions here, because it's in Teams. So a question to the SDK, to the framework, are we rendered in Teams? And if so, can we get the user credentials? We're seeing here Microsoft Teams is in Teams. And that's very interesting because basically this gives us the opportunity to dive into how the Blazor Teams toolkit is talking to Teams. And the truth is that what is happening behind the scenes is that Blazor offers you the opportunity to do what's called JavaScript interoperability, meaning that from the .NET side, from the C# part, you can talk with JavaScript libraries. We all know that Teams has a great JavaScript SDK that is available. And to a certain degree, what we are seeing here, or what the Blazor application basically, or the Teams toolkit in Blazor basically does is being like a layer between the Teams SDK for JavaScript and us as .NET developers, and make that basically available. How is the toolkit doing this? Yeah, in C# you see here is in Teams. You just call Microsoft Teams is in Teams. Why? You could inject this class, this service, just with dependency injections. You see here there is still 3 different parts: Teams FX, Teams user credential, and Microsoft Teams. I suspect in the future, before the release version is ready, we might only have one service here, or one namespace here. Would make more sense from my perspective. But for now, we have 3 different, and we want to have a closer look at this is in Teams method. So go to definition. Why is that possible? Because under interop Teams SDK, there is the file Microsoft Teams C# that we are or that we just opened by going to the implementation. And you see here the method specification is in Teams, and it just returns invoke async in Teams. This invoke async comes from inheritance because there is an interop module base implementation. But in the end, what it actually does is it calls a JavaScript function through the technology that Blazor allows us. Because if I open up the module base class, you basically see here invoke void async, import modules. So that's the wiring basically between the JavaScript SDK and .NET, and it's abstracted in a certain degree through this class here, and I just need to call in Teams. The interesting part is that we can also see that in JavaScript here. So because there's this Teams JS Blazor interop file, and here you see the different JavaScript functions. And let's check that if we can find it. Yeah, it doesn't matter if we find that is in Teams, but we can talk through the get context async, same thing. If you want to get the context, the Teams context of the environment you are working with, of course, in JavaScript, it's just Microsoft Teams get context, and then you create the promise and resolve it. And basically, there is a JavaScript file that already provides you with the function, and then already it's everything in there from a C# way to easily call those JavaScript functions. That's basically how the toolkit works with the Teams SDK, and this offers up all the different opportunities and all the different possibilities the Teams SDK opens to everyone, so to all the Node.js and React developers out there. We can make use of those things as well from the .NET side of the house because of how this interop thing is architectured and layered already in this application. So this is the one main thing to realize about the toolkit. It is using the Teams JavaScript SDK through Blazor JavaScript interop technology. Another interesting part is that we can take this another step forward. If I restart the application now, so we are again at the installation script. You could modify your launch settings, by the way, from Visual Studio to directly point you to the tab instance. So you wouldn't need to install it all the time, but I would suggest that you create a second profile for that, because sometimes you want to experience the installment because you want to debug things or you want to try something out if it's a Teams tab or a static tab. So you need that screen sometimes, but of course now we could go the easy way route and make a shortcut here. But what we want to do now is that we see here down there, there's a button called authorized. And we want to click that because we are now just looking at the page and we are not connected to the graph yet. But if I click on authorize here, we should see a pop-up. Exactly. You see here a permission request, so a consent form or consent screen, because through the scaffolding to the creation of my solution here, my project here, we created an ADCD 2020 Teams Toolkit demo application, and we never consented it. As I told you, I'm working with my Microsoft 365 developer tenant, so I'm a global admin here. I can consent on behalf of my organization this app. I will do that. And then we see a nice picture of me and my email address and my name. So what happened behind the scenes? If we look at the welcome Razor page, you will see that those Fluent tabs are basically those numbers here, 1, 2, 3. So there are 3 different tabs in this page. We are at the first one, and then there are different components, or this tab is then also structured with different components, and we are looking basically at the graph component. So we have a graph.razor file, and this file basically is the implementation of the picture and the profile card. You see here a profile card, and the interesting part is, again, it's somehow structured and layered already out nicely. We have a profile card, and we have parameters that we hand over to this profile card, like the user photo and the actual profile. But in this Razor file, actually, we talk to the graph because we are getting a graph client here, get graph service client, and then we use the regular graph.net SDK to get the profile picture or get the profile photo URI with await graph me request get async, and that basically is handed over for parameters to my profile card. Let me open that up for a second. And then basically this markup is used to show the picture. So display name, mail, office location, and the picture here. So this markup basically is rendered here, and it's structured in a component for visualization. But the interesting part to me, for example, is this one here, because here we see how we gonna talk to the graph. And the interesting part is, I stopped it for a second for make it a little bit bigger here. You see here that we have a graph service client method, or a get graph service client method to be precise, here. And what it does, it basically creates a new graph service client with an MS Graph auth provider. And this MS Graph auth provider is part of the SDK or the Teams toolkit, and it takes the Teams user credential and some initial scopes. And the Teams user credentials are coming from something that is injected to, or we are using dependency injection to have the Teams user credential. And here we have get token async. And that's basically the magic behind the scenes, because with those two method calls, we are, in the end of the day, getting the SSO token from Teams. And with that SSO token, we are creating a new graph service client based on a special MS Graph auth provider that's also coming from the Teams SDK or the Teams .NET library here. And in the end of the day, what we get here is just a regular graph client. So this gives you a regular graph service client. It's nothing special, nothing special in terms of Teams. That's just from the regular graph SDK. We can double check that if we open up our NuGet packages. You see Microsoft Graph. It's the regular client, Microsoft Graph client library. Nothing special to Teams. There are those two packages that are installed as part of the project or solution scaffolding, TeamsFX and TeamsFX Simple Auth, that take care of the, as it says here, single line statements with zero configuration, this F5 experience, and also helping you with the authentication. But from there, you are getting there with a normal graph call. From here, it's very easy now to reach out to different endpoints in Microsoft Graph, because what happened behind the scenes, if I open up the Azure portal of my account, and I told you don't need to remember the name, but we will find it here. Our demo application that we created with the scaffolding of the project. See the date here. And what you would need to do now is that you, of course, just would need to add different permissions in here. So, for example, if you want to, I don't know, list all the teams that your user is member of, or do anything special with Microsoft Graph, you would just need to go to your Azure portal, add a permission in here, like you would do for all the different things. Yeah, you need this. You probably are familiar with some of the scopes. Let's just search for one. Team. Let's go for read basic all, add permissions, and with the admin consent, do I need that? Oh, I wouldn't need that, but I grant it anyway. From that point in time now, I would be able to call that graph endpoint from here. That's very, very interesting and helps you to reach out to all the different endpoints of graph. But if you want to even go further, you could also integrate the PnP core library into your application with one minor thing you need to think of, because what you're getting here is a graph token in the end of the day, and this graph token has a resource URI that's bound to the graph. So if you want to talk to a SharePoint REST service, you would need to swap that token in terms of you have the token, you have all the permissions, but you would need to define another resource URI, SharePoint Online, for example. And for that, you would need to make a special call, including the client secret of the application that you created. And The client secret is the last part of this demo, because remember the first screen I showed you when creating the application, we saw all the different app settings, all the different things that it created with client ID, identifiers, all those configuration steps, but there is no secret. It's not part of that file, because the secret is stored here in Manage User Secrets. So you see the client secret in here, meaning you just can use the secret store from Visual Studio that's built within, and you would just need to grab that client secret, then swap your token, and you will be able to also talk to the PNP core library. And then with that, you are in the position to talk to the graph, talk to SharePoint, and yeah, just make use of all the different APIs that are out there. That brings me basically back to where are we? Our slide deck here. Stefan already did that, but I want to stress that some else in the ending. Please check out all the different resources of the Microsoft 365 Pattern and Practices group, aka.ms/m365pnp, for all the different samples, not only for Teams, but of course for everything in Microsoft 365. I think there are now 3 or 4 samples already available based on Blazor. I'm in the process of publishing the latest ones based on the SDK that's 2 weeks old. So in a couple of days, that should be available there as well. And then, the next steps. And I'm also closing with the same question that Stefan asked you. With all what you saw in the last 2 hours, the main question is, what are you going to build in Teams and with bots? Thank you very much.